I still remember the sound of the wine bottle being set down a little too carefully on the table. Not a bang, just that particular kind of deliberate quiet that means someone is composing themselves before they speak. My boyfriend's father had been talking for about 20 minutes at that point. Not to the table, to me. I want to be clear about something. He wasn't a cruel man. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He was the kind of person who fills silences because he genuinely believes the silence needs filling, and he had spent 32 years as a corporate litigator in Calgary, which means he had spent 32 years being the most prepared person in any room he walked into. That doesn't go away at retirement, it just redirects. We were at my boyfriend Adrian's parents' house in Cochrane, about 40 minutes west of Calgary, in one of those newer builds that looks out onto the mountains. His mother had made lamb. The table was set with the kind of care that tells you the evening mattered to someone. Good napkins. The real wine glasses, not the everyday ones. I had been looking forward to this for months. Adrian and I had been together for 3 years. His parents had been in Portugal for most of that time. His father, Gerald, had taken a consulting role with a firm in Lisbon right around when we started dating, and his mother, Annette, had gone with him because she'd always wanted to live abroad, and this was finally the chance. They'd come home for Christmas twice. But those visits were busy and short, and I'd only met them briefly in the way you meet people at crowded family gatherings where everyone is distracted and no one has time to actually talk. This dinner was the real introduction. Annette had planned it. She'd texted Adrian 3 weeks out to confirm and had asked what I liked to eat and whether I had any allergies. She was warm and curious and kept touching my arm when she laughed. I liked her immediately. Gerald was different. Not cold, just certain. He had that particular energy of someone who's been right so many times about so many things that being right has become less a practice and more a personality. He'd asked me early on what I did, and I told him I worked in financial regulation, which is technically true and also the version of the truth I give at dinner tables when I don't want the rest of the evening to become a performance. He'd nodded in a way that suggested he was filing this away under adequate and moved on. The conversation had been pleasant enough through the first course. Adrian was doing most of the talking, catching his parents up on things, a friend's new house, a camping trip we'd taken in the Kootenays in September, his sister's job change. Annette asked questions and actually listened to the answers. Gerald ate steadily and offered occasional observations. Then Gerald asked if I'd been following the news about the OSC. I told him I had. He set his fork down in a way that suggested a pivot was coming. The Ontario Securities Commission had been in the middle of a fairly significant policy debate that fall, something to do with updated reporting requirements for investment dealers and how they intersected with some recent amendments to National Instrument 31 to 134. It had been generating a lot of coverage in the financial press and a lot of opinion, most of it from people who understood pieces of the picture but not the whole thing. Gerald, it turned out, had opinions. He had been on the board of a mid-size investment firm for several years before he retired, which gave him a working familiarity with compliance frameworks and regulatory filings. He knew enough to sound authoritative, and he did sound authoritative. That much I'll give him. The cadence was confident. The terminology was mostly right. He cited 2 recent articles he'd read, one from the Financial Post and one from somewhere else I didn't catch. But the analysis had gaps in it, not small gaps, structural ones. He was conflating 2 separate instruments in a way that happens often with people who have read about a thing rather than worked inside it. He was also describing the enforcement posture of the Commission in a way that hadn't been accurate for about 4 years. There had been a fairly substantial internal shift in how the OSC approached proactive versus reactive enforcement around 2021, and the framework he was describing was the old one. I know this because I helped write part of the guidance document that updated it. I didn't say that, not then. I nodded. I said something that was true and also neutral, that it was a complicated area and a lot of people were reading it differently. Gerald took this as agreement and kept going. Adrian glanced at me once. He knows, broadly, what I do. He doesn't know the specifics. That's partly professional, partly just the nature of a job that doesn't make for easy dinner conversation. But he knows enough to know when a gap is forming between what someone is saying and what I might actually think about it. I saw him clock it and then very carefully look back at his plate. Annette refilled my glass. Gerald moved on to talking about what he thought the commission should do differently. This part was, if anything, more confident and also less accurate. He had a theory about why enforcement actions had slowed in a particular sector, and the theory was plausible on its face, but incorrect. The actual reason was a staffing and jurisdictional issue that had since been resolved, which I also knew because I had been in the room for some of those conversations. I ate my lamb. It was very good. Annette had done something with preserved lemon that I made a note to ask about later. At some point, Gerald said something that made Annette laugh, and the conversation shifted slightly, and I thought we might move on to something else entirely. We didn't. He circled back. He wanted to know what I thought. Genuinely, I think. He wasn't performing. He was interested in the topic, and he thought he was talking to someone who worked somewhere adjacent to it. I said I thought some of the reporting changes were overdue, and that implementation would be the harder problem. He agreed with this in the way that people agree when they think you've confirmed what they already believed. Then Annette asked how long I'd been in the field. She asked it lightly, the way you ask something, because you want to know more about a person, not because you're making a point. I told her I'd been at the commission itself for about 7 years, that I'd moved into a senior policy role about 2 years ago. There was a pause. Gerald looked at me in a way I recognized. It was the look of someone doing quiet arithmetic, running what they've just heard against what they've been saying for the past half hour. I kept my voice even. I wasn't trying to make a moment of it. I added that the area he'd been talking about, the 31,103 amendments, was actually close to my team's work, which was why I'd been listening carefully. Another pause, longer this time. Gerald said, "Which division?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think I may have presented at one of your policy consultations 3 or 4 years ago." This I didn't know. I said it was possible. We ran a lot of consultations, and I hadn't been leading that particular file at the time. He picked up his wine glass and looked at it for a second. "I think I owe you a more accurate picture of what I was describing," he said, "because I think I had some of that wrong." That was it. That was the whole thing. No scene, no grand confrontation, just a man who had built his life on being prepared, recognizing that he had walked into a room he didn't have the full map for, and saying so. I told him he'd actually had the broad strokes right, which was true. The enforcement posture piece was off, but his read on the political pressure behind the reporting changes was pretty sharp. I said that. He seemed genuinely pleased by this, in the way that people are pleased when they find out they were partially right instead of completely wrong. Annette was smiling at her plate. Adrian, I noticed, had finally relaxed his shoulders. After dinner, while Annette and Adrian cleared the table and started in on the dishes, Gerald and I sat in the living room with the rest of the wine. He asked me real questions this time. Not the kind designed to establish a position, but the kind that come from actual curiosity. He wanted to know how policy consultation actually worked in practice, whether public comment periods had any real effect, what the internal culture was like. I told him honestly. Some of it was tedious, some of it mattered more than people realized. The work wasn't glamorous, but it had weight, in the way that the infrastructure underneath a city has weight. Invisible until it fails, but the reason things hold together. He said, "Adrian mentioned you worked in finance. I didn't think to ask more than that." I said most people don't. The job title doesn't exactly command a room. He smiled at that. I should have asked. Outside, the mountains had gone dark against a sky that was still faintly lit at the edges. Annette came in from the kitchen and sat down, and the four of us talked until almost 11, the way you do when the evening turns out better than anyone had quite expected. In the car on the way home, Adrian didn't say anything for a few minutes. Then, he never does that. I asked what he meant. Corrects himself. He never does that. In the middle of a conversation. Like that. I looked out the window. The highway back to Calgary was dark and flat, and the stars were close in a way they never are in the city. I said I thought his father was actually pretty impressive. Adrian laughed like I'd surprised him. You're not annoyed. I thought about it. Honestly thought about it. The truth was, no, not really. Gerald had made assumptions about who I was based on limited information, and he had been wrong, and when he found out he was wrong, he had the character to say so without making a performance of it. That's not nothing. In my experience, that's actually fairly rare. The thing about working in regulatory policy is that you spend a lot of time in rooms where people talk past each other, where turf and ego and the fear of being wrong all tangle together and make it almost impossible for anyone to actually change their mind about anything. You see the alternative often enough that you learn to recognize the real thing when it shows up. Gerald had done the harder thing. I told Adrian I liked him. I think he'll be easier to talk to from here. Adrian reached over and squeezed my hand once, the way he does when he doesn't have words for something. I looked back out at the dark and thought about the lamb and the mountains and the way Annette had filled my glass without being asked, and the particular feeling of a night that could have gone a dozen different ways and chose the one where everyone came out of it a little better than they went in. I thought, I'll ask her about the preserved lemon next time. There was going to be a next time. I was already sure of it. The drive back from Cochrane was quiet in the good way, the kind of quiet that settles after something goes better than it had any right to. I've thought about that dinner a lot since then. Not the part where Gerald was wrong. That part was almost incidental. I've thought about what happened after. The pause. The recalculation. And then those words, I think I may have had some of that wrong. There's a version of that evening that goes differently. I've seen that version play out plenty of times in other rooms. The person doubles down. They find a way to reframe what they said so that technically, in some narrow reading, they weren't wrong at all. They protect the image of themselves as someone who doesn't make errors. It costs them nothing in the moment and everything over time because the people across the table notice and they remember. Gerald didn't do that, and I think it's worth sitting with why. He'd built a long career on being prepared, on knowing the material, on not walking into a room without the full picture. So when it turned out he didn't have the full picture, that had to land somewhere uncomfortable. That kind of discomfort is a test, not a dramatic one. Nobody's watching, nobody's keeping score. Just a quiet test of whether the version of yourself you've built over decades actually holds up when it costs something to maintain it. He passed, quietly, without making it a moment. I think about how much of professional life, and honestly, just life, comes down to exactly that. Not the big declarations, not the resume lines, the small, unwitnessed choices about whether to be honest when honesty is inconvenient, whether to stay curious about something even when your existing opinion is more comfortable, whether to keep showing up to hard things long enough to actually get good at them. What I do for work is not exciting to explain at dinner tables. Regulatory policy doesn't have a lot of natural drama, but it requires all three of those things in sustained, unglamorous doses. You have to care enough about getting it right that you'll sit through your 15th version of the same consultation document. You have to be willing to not know something and to go find out. And you have to have the spine to hold a position when the room is pushing back, and also the honesty to change it when the room is actually right. Gerald had that. He just hadn't had the chance to show it to me yet. Adrian said he never corrects himself mid-conversation. I believed him, which made it mean more, not less. There's a kind of respect that doesn't require announcing itself. Gerald earned mine that night. Not when he was wrong, but in the 30 seconds after he found out. That's when character shows up, not in the credentials on the wall or the years of experience behind them. In the 30 seconds when it would have been easier to deflect. I think about that when I'm in rooms that feel important, when I'm the one who got something wrong or might have or isn't sure yet. I want to be the kind of person who can do what he did. I'm still working on it.